Hi, I'm Pastor Anthony Savaggio of the Rochester Christian Reformed Church. This is episode 4 of the Bible Bistro, and we're looking at an introduction to the book of Lamentations. I'll be preaching on that book later this summer, so these are to set up that and hopefully to help you engage with that. And as you see on the menu today at the Bistro, we have the structure and the outline of the book. But before we get to those subjects, I wanted to just share a little bit in continuity from the last episode. In that episode, I mentioned the book by Kathleen M. O'Connor. She's a professor of Hebrew Scriptures at Columbia Theological Union in Decatur, Georgia. At least she was when she wrote this. And this is an excellent little book on Lamentations. I highly recommend it. It's called Lamentations and the Tears of the World. And if you remember, it's Kathleen O'Connor who gave that phrase, the missing voice of God, and the power of the missing voice. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that. And also, just wanted to share with you her reflection on the purposes of the acrostic. I know I seem to be obsessed with the acrostic, but it is so important to understanding the book. And it's something that's just totally invisible to us when we read the book in English. We just don't grasp it because it doesn't carry over into the English translation, but it's so important. And here's what Kathleen O'Connor says about that on page 13 of her book. She writes, Lamentations' alphabetic devices are deeply symbolic. They expose the depth and breadth of suffering in conflicting ways. The alphabet gives both order and shape to suffering that is otherwise inherently chaotic, formless, and out of control. Think about that. These people are suffering tremendously. Their life has become chaotic. Everything they trusted in is gone, and yet the structure of the book is put together with order. And how meaningful that is to people enduring chaos. She goes on, it signifies the enormity of suffering as a vast universe of pain extending from A to Z, quote unquote, right? This completeness idea, to which nothing more can be added. Completeness. She goes on, it tries to force unspeakable pain into a container that is familiar and recognizable even as suffering eludes containment. The alphabet, familiar, recognizable. The suffering so great, it tries to pour it into that container. She concludes, it implies that suffering is infinite, for it spans the basic components of written language from beginning to end. All the vocabulary, all we have, the capacity of language is filled up with the suffering of Jerusalem, the suffering of Israel. That's what she says. Great stuff, right? Great insights. Here's what she says about the missing voice that I mentioned. Remember, God does not actively engage in this book. He does not actively speak. He's the missing voice in the book. This is her reflection on that in the introduction, page 15. Kathleen O'Connor once again. The one thing about which all the book's speakers agree is that God must respond to them in their suffering. God must see, pay attention, and remember them. God must take into the divine consciousness the overwhelming destitution in which they live. Only in chapter 3 does God respond, and only briefly in quoted, remembered speech of the past, not directly. That's Lamentations 3, verse 57, by the way. She goes on, God's voice is missing, and the book is God abandoned. But primarily because God is silent, Lamentations expresses human experiences of abandonment with full force. Listen to what she says here. And God never speaks. The book honors voices of pain. And because God never speaks, the book honors voices of pain. Do you get that? Lamentations is a house for sorrow because there is no speech for God. What she's saying is that God's missing voice gives amplification, gives focus to the extent of human suffering, its significance, its importance. She writes, and because God never speaks, the book honors voices of pain, the missing voice of God. We'll talk more about that, including in the sermon series. Okay, so that's a couple of reflections there from Kathleen O'Connor on her work, which I'll be using in my preaching as well. And I think it's very important, by the way, to have to use a female voice in this situation because there are so many female representations in the book and some disturbing ones as well. So I'll be using her as part of my commentary list. Now, let's talk about what's on the menu at the Bistro today, structure and outline. Let's talk about the structure and outline of the book. And first of all, I'm looking for my pen because I usually point with my pen. So let's talk about the structure. The structure of the book, you can see, as we've already talked about, there are 5 chapters, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we've talked about the verses in those chapters related to the acrostic. 22 in the first chapter, 22 in the second chapter, 66 in the third chapter, 22 in the fourth chapter, 22 in the fifth chapter. Now, many people have taken from that a structure which focuses the centrality on chapter 3. Why? Well, one, it's in the center of the 5 chapters, and also because it has 66 verses rather than 22, the idea of an intensification, 3 times the intensification found in that chapter. And also that chapter has, in verses 31 to 33 of chapter 3, kind of this expression of hope for the people. And let me just read that to you. Chapter 3, verses 31 to 33. Remember, this is a book of lament. There's a lot of crying out. God's voice is not present. There's not a lot of hope. It's pretty dark. But here in chapter 3, verses 31 to 33, there's some hope interjected. For the Lord will not reject forever. Although he causes grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love, for he does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. And of course, it is in this chapter 3 that we have those lyrics from the hymn, Great is Thy Faithfulness, in verses 22 to 23. Now, there's some debate about that because maybe this is overemphasized, the centrality of chapter 3. But there's certainly something going on there given its amplification and size. Okay, so basic structure. Let's talk about the outline of the book. And I think what I want to do here too is I'll be using the basic outline, which comes from this book, A Biblical Theological Introduction to the Old Testament, The Gospel Promise, edited by a variety of people, published by Crossway. Big giant book. Love big giant hardcover books. Big fan of those. But the chapter on Lamentations is written by Peter Lee, and this outline is from Peter Lee. So, and most people come to the same outline, but I'll use his words to kind of express this. So, if you look at the 5 chapters, what's chapter 1 about? Let's just put that in a little nutshell. It's about the shame and mourning of the city. The shame and mourning of the city. Lee writes this: the themes that dominate this chapter are shame and remorse brought on by the rebellion of the city of Jerusalem. The city is personified as a woman. We've talked about that, Lady Zion, daughter Zion. And the poet utilizes a plethora of female images to portray the curse of the covenant against Lady Jerusalem, a lonely widow, a dethroned queen reduced to the status of a maiden, a treacherous wife betrayed by her adulterous lovers, one sexually abused and stripped naked, and a ritually unclean menstruating woman. As you can tell, there are a variety of images here that can be disturbing, troubling on many levels. And we need to wrestle with that language. Again, that's why I want to make sure I'm looking at also female commentators on this subject. But that's what you're going to see. It starts out dark. It starts out with the shame and mourning of the city, particularly personified in Lady Zion. Now, chapter 2, we have the Lord as the agent of wrath. And so what we are told here, there's no doubt, okay, what's going on. The struggle and suffering of Jerusalem is not attributed to outside agencies. Nobody's blaming the devil here. This is God doing this. And there's no doubt about it in the narrator's mind that the city is suffering the direct hand of God. There's no effort to attribute that suffering elsewhere. So the Lord is the primary agent of wrath, chapter 2. Lee says this: whereas Lamentations 1 is more interested in the subjective misery of Judah, okay, Lamentations 2 focuses on the agent of that misery, the Lord as the enemy of the personified city. That's something we also have to struggle with, the Lord as the agent of wrath. Chapter 3, the afflicted man and the community. And this is the lament of the afflicted man and the community. Here's where we have the narrator perhaps shifting, right? We move into this both personal lament of this afflicted man and also the communal lament of the city of Jerusalem. This is what Lee writes. The third poem changes the persona of the poem from the female voice of Lamentations 1 to 2 to a man who has seen affliction under the rod of God's wrath. Now, this is important. Remember, we talked about how the Lady Zion disappears, if you will. Her voice disappears after chapter 2, and it's picked up here and embodied by this poet, this narrator, this afflicted man. The suffering of the man is strikingly brutal. The description of the man also makes many allusions to the biblical Job, which gives the sense that he specifically represents the righteous remnant who are exiled due to their membership within the covenant community of Judah. So remember this, so that maybe we have a man personifying Israel, the exiled community, the remnant of Israel there. So that shift happens. We have the lament in its deepest. Maybe this is the centerpiece of the book, the intensification, the 66 chapters, the afflicted man and the community. The man's perspective comes in chapter 2, verses 1 through 39, and then also again in 48 to 66. The community is expressed, sandwiched between in chapter 2, verses 40 to 47. All right, let's talk about chapter 4, the city besieged. The city besieged. We go back to focusing on the city, and I mentioned here all classes. So it cuts across all socioeconomic strata here. The whole city is besieged. This is what Lee writes about that. Lamentations 4 shares similar characteristics with the poem in Lamentations 3, and that both graphically depict the physical effects of the exile upon the inhabitants of the city. The siege motif is prevalent in this poem, and its immediate impact upon the city is displayed using disturbing images. Great, more disturbing images here in chapter 4. Finally, chapter 5 is the communal lament, the finale, if you will, of that communal lament. And this is what Lee writes about that. The book of Lamentations comes to a somewhat abrupt end. It does do that. It doesn't end with a happy ending. It's an abrupt end. He writes, with this final communal lament, the inhabitants of the city, men, women, and children, are mentioned as experiencing physical suffering from their enemies. They are discouraged and ill, yet the poem ends with a glimmer of hope as it appeals to the Lord as their king to remember and restore them. So it ends on this communal lament, and here's how it ends. I'll read to you the last few verses from chapter 5, verses 19 through 22. But you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure, period, the end. That's how the book ends. It doesn't end with restoration. It doesn't end with assurance. It ends with, Lord, why, right? Why have you forgotten us? Why have you forsaken us? A prayer, restore us to yourself, O Lord. But yet there is this ambiguity, this sense of maybe this won't happen, right? Unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. That's how this book ends. And that's, it leaves us there in that moment. It doesn't wrap up things. There's no epilogue like the book of Job where things are restored. It ends on that note of suffering, of lament, but yet hope in the Lord, and repentance, the need for repentance and looking to the Lord. So that's how the book is organized. That's the structure. It looks like chapter 3 obviously is a magnification here, maybe the centerpiece of it. The outline goes from the shame and mourning of the city, the Lord's role in causing that suffering, the communal lament and the afflicted man's lament, the city besieged and across all socioeconomic strata, and then finally the communal lament ending on this ambiguous, unanswered, kind of stuck there in the moment of wondering whether the Lord will deliver and will hear the cry of the lament from his people. Of course, we know he does. And he does so through Jesus Christ. In the next couple of episodes, we will look at two different things. We'll look at what Lamentations has to say about suffering, and what it has to say about Jesus Christ. Those will be the last two in the series of Bible Bistros on Lamentations. So thanks for tuning in. Thanks for coming to the Bistro. Thanks for sampling off the menu. I hope that you found this a good meal, a good snack at least, and to help you engage with this book as I preach on it later on this summer. Thanks for tuning in. God bless you.